Chapter 9. Jose Moreno waved at them as Gabe parked the vehicle by the red building on the corner of Main Street. Rory stepped out and looked around the small seaside village. Buildings of all different colors and sizes were all around her. There were signs in Spanish as well as a tea shop and a church with a Welsh name. It was great to see people from so many different backgrounds living in harmony together in one village. Gabe placed a gentle hand on the small of her back as she walked beside him. "Señor and Señora, good, you're here." Jose shook their hands and waved for them to follow. "Come, I take you to Maria's family's place. You will see a lot of sea plants." "That sounds good. Thanks, Jose." Rory remembered what Gabe had said about her learning how to be more courageous when she spoke to others. At least she was trying. It was a short walk between trees and small houses until they stopped at a small yellow house. It was a simple flat-board home, square in shape, with only a few windows. As they arrived, Jose called out, "Pedro, you home?" A man very similar in height and build to Jose stepped out the door, followed by a woman with grey hair who stood by his side. 5 children quickly scampered out the door behind their parents. The oldest 3 boys seemed like they were between the ages of 12 to 16, and the 2 youngest girls looked like they were much younger. They ran to hug their mother. "These 2 guests come from the resort where Maria is. They are interested in sea plants," Jose explained. Rory stepped forward to shake their hands, and Gabe did the same. "You see my Maria?" the mother asked Rory. "Yes, I have. Maria has been a great help to us." Rory didn't explain all that was going on because she didn't want to worry Maria's mother. Gabe's private investigator had arrived just before they left the resort this morning. Max Harrington was going to talk to the police. Hopefully Carlos, the man who had been threatening Maria, would soon be behind bars. "Maria is a wonderful daughter, Mrs. Moreno." "Gracias, señora. Call me Lucia." The mother waved Rory to follow her. They walked past the hill and down toward the rocky beach and the ocean's edge. "If you want sea plants, señora, you've come to the right place." Lucia took her to a large inlet where there was a vast amount of seaweed, marine algae, and other sea plants. Maria's mother pulled seaweed and brown marine algae from along the water's edge. Rory held it in her hands, and a wide grin stretched the corners of her mouth. "It's perfect and so pure, and there's so much here." Rory could hardly believe her eyes as she looked around her. It was just what she needed. "You want, señora?" "Yes, very much." Rory realized this was her chance to ask for the help she needed. With a quick look at Gabe, who nodded at her, she looked back at Lucia. The children crowded close as she asked their mother, "Could I hire you and your family to hand harvest these sea plants? I'm looking for a group of people or a family who would be willing to do this every month. I would pay you well. Maybe you could talk to your husband and see if that's something your family would like to do." Lucia glanced at her husband, and Spanish words flew back and forth between them. Her husband shrugged as if to say it was up to his wife. "Sí, señora, we will do this." "Oh, thank you. My husband Gabe and I will get the contract written up, and then we will set things up properly." Rory spoke to Lucia, who nodded. They started back to the house. They were just about to leave when Lucia's troubled brown eyes looked over at Rory. "Please, will you tell Maria her mama longs for her to come home?" Rory could feel the heavy burden Maria's mother carried for her children. "I promise. I'll talk to Maria and ask her to come see you." Lucia squeezed her hand tightly once more and put her hand to her heart. Her brown eyes were filled with tears, and Rory squeezed her hand. It was an unspoken heartfelt gesture that each of them deeply understood. Both Gabe and her waved goodbye and hurried back to the waiting jeep. It was only after they had driven for a few minutes in silence that Gabe spoke. "Rory, you amaze me. Not only were you able to negotiate a contract for the supplies you need for your skincare products, but from those tears in Lucia's eyes, it was like she trusted and connected with you quickly." Rory shrugged. "Maybe it's a woman-to-woman thing. I just can't imagine how difficult it must be for her as a mother not to see her child for years. As I talked with Maria's mom, my own memories of the pain and heartache of growing up without my parents hit me hard. In that moment, I realized I would do whatever I could to help Lucia and Maria to be united again." Gabe nodded slightly. Like I said, you're amazing. Thanks, Gabe. Rory warmed at his words. She could easily admit that having her husband compliment her felt wonderful. If he appreciated her, did that mean love was possible? Rory didn't know, but a small flare of hope was kindled, which she kept hidden in her heart of hearts. The two of them drove onto the parking lot, only to see two police cruisers parked at odd angles in front of the main building of the resort. They had just stepped out of the Jeep when the doors opened and two policemen walked out of the building, each holding onto Carlos Santos' arms. Carlos was handcuffed and spewed angry words as they led him down the stairs into the waiting police cruiser. Max Harrington followed close behind, standing on the steps as the police drove away with Carlos Santos. Come, let's go hear what Max has to say. Gabe reached for her hand, and they walked toward the front entrance. As soon as Max spotted them, he hurried over. As you probably saw, we managed to find enough dirt on Carlos for him to spend time behind bars for years. We discovered multiple incidents of human trafficking. That was what he was forcing Maria and some other girls at the resort to be involved in. Not only did he force them to give them half of their wages, but he also threatened to harm their families if they said anything. That's terrible. Rory sucked in air, horrified that something like that had happened to Maria. Turns out, that's not the only thing we found. Carlos was also involved in trafficking illegal drugs as well as humans. Needless to say, the police will have enough to hold him in jail for a very long time. Max grinned. Gabe nodded. Good. At least justice is done. He looked over at Rory. Maria and the other girls would be safe now that Carlos has been caught. Rory nodded and her body shivered at what they discovered about Carlos. She was just grateful Maria was safe. I need to find Maria and ask if she's okay. She started to walk forward, but Max spoke suddenly. Before you go, I wanted to let you both know that my team found some fingerprints at the site of the fire on Walker's Island. We're in the process now of checking out what we found, and we should have some answers in the next day or two. Rory looked from Max to Gabe, swallowing back fear that coiled in her belly. She nodded, and her hand shook as she toyed with a long strand of hair. Good. Thanks, Max. Why was her voice suddenly so strained? Max's phone rang loudly, startling her. He looked at the caller ID and spoke to Gabe. I need to get this, Gabe. I'll talk to you soon. Of course. Thanks, Max. We look forward to hearing what you found. Gabe stepped beside Rory and slipped his arm around her waist. Come, we'll go up to our suite. You're looking slightly wobbly on your feet. Gabe walked close by her side into the resort. As the elevator doors opened to their floor, Rory saw Maria pushing her cart down the hallway. I need to talk to Maria, Gabe. I'll be back soon. Rory hurried down the hallway. Maria, Rory called out to the maid who stopped and turned. Thank you for stopping to talk. I just wanted to ask if you heard the news that Carlos was arrested. Si, I did, Signora. I'm very happy. It was the first time since she'd met Maria that Rory saw a bright smile free of worry and fear. I'm so glad. You deserve to be happy, Maria. Rory noticed the maid's smile was hesitant, as if unsure. And I wanted to tell you that I went to visit your parents to ask if your family would consider harvesting sea plants for my skincare products. They've said yes. That's real good, Signora. Maria nodded, her eyes pensive, as if pondering what that would all mean for her family. But the best part is your mama asked you to come home. She misses you, as does your whole family. Rory looked at the maid, hoping she wasn't overstepping her boundaries by acting as the middle person. Si, Signora, now I am free to go home. Carlos no more can hurt me or my family. Her brown eyes brimmed with tears, and she quickly wiped them away. I'm so happy for you, Maria. Impulsively, Rory gave the maid a big hug. My husband and I will be leaving tomorrow, but we'll be back soon. I look forward to seeing you again. And you are free now. Go and be happy, Maria. The maid nodded, a big smile on her lovely face. Turning, Rory walked back to their hotel room, feeling so happy that things had turned out so well for Maria. Entering their room, Rory collapsed onto the sofa. Her mind was still spinning with both Maria and Max's news. However, it was Max's news that they were close to finding out the identity of the person that started the fire on the island that disturbed her most. Wrapping her arms around herself, she tried to calm her queasy stomach. "Talk to me, Rory." Gabe sat down beside her and slipped his strong arms around her, pulling her close. His warm breath whispered softly in her ear. "You're worried about who Max and his team will identify as the person who started that fire, aren't you?" Rory looked over at him, her eyes wide, wondering how he could have read her mind. "How do you know that, Gabe?" "Because I know you, my beautiful water sprite." Rory offered him a small smile. "You haven't called me that in years." "I know. You don't mind?" Gabe's blue eyes sparkled with a little bit of mischief. "No, I don't mind. I have fond memories of those summers we spent together." Rory smiled, trying to lighten the mood, but her thoughts kept returning to the trouble they had on the island. Her husband chuckled beside her, the rumbling in his chest a comforting sound to Rory. He sat silent for a moment, and then placing a finger under her chin, tipped it up so he could look deeply into her eyes. "But on a more serious note, I think I've learned a little something about you. Do you want to know what I think?" "I'm all ears." "I think you believe that the person they will discover started the fire at your aunt's cottage is someone that you knew and loved when you were a child, and that terrifies you." Gabe lifted her blonde hair away from her eyes, searching for the truth. Tears formed in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "It's true, Gabe. I'm very afraid that I won't recover from what I find when the truth comes out." "What can I do, Gabe? How do I get through this?" "We'll get through this together. When they uncover the truth, I'll be right there beside you." There was a tender warmth in her husband's eyes. "Do you promise, Gabe?" A few more stray tears edged out of the corners of her eyes as she looked over at her husband. Just for that moment, she was 6 years old again, filled with fear, asking him if he would keep his promise to marry her, if she was still afraid when she grew up. She'd been so scared when she first moved to the island. The horror of the loss of her parents and the only home she'd ever known had made her fear almost everything and everyone around her. Except Gabe. He'd been so kind and gentle to her that she had attached herself to him and followed him around from the first day she saw him. Gabe had been the brother she'd never had, at least until she grew to be a teenager when her feelings had blossomed into more. But now her husband only wanted a fake relationship. He only wanted to be friends, and it confused her when he was so gentle and lover-like, similar to how he was acting now. Rory blinked and her eyes widened as he leaned his head close to hers. "I promise, Rory." Gabe's gentle fingers wiped tears that had fallen down her cheeks. His eyes darkened to a deep blue, and he stared at her for a moment before he lowered his head and touched gentle lips to hers. The caress of his lips on hers ignited an explosion of butterflies in her belly. Tingles of awareness surged up her arms, and she placed her hands around her husband's neck. For Rory, suddenly the world had gone from many shades of gray to being lit up with all the colors of the rainbow. She leaned closer to her husband, each touch of their lips kindling a growing passion. Without warning, Gabe's phone started ringing, startling them both. Reluctantly, he pulled his lips from hers, his blue eyes dark like a stormy sea. He looked at the caller ID. "I'm sorry, Rory, but I've got to take this call. It might be important." Dazed, she nodded. Gabe's voice trailed off as he disappeared with his phone into his room. Already she missed his closeness. Her husband was fast becoming the one person she longed to be with all the time. Rory hoped they would only grow closer when they returned back home to the island. Would that even be possible?